This hour of news and views is sponsored by African Muslims Agency. African Muslims Agency, a beacon of hope to communities for over 35 years in Africa and beyond. And with that being said, before we took the news, we had an interview lined up, which is the interview that we're going to be having right now. We'll be chatting to Fazlin. Fazlin is the director of research at Kijami Research, and she'll be chatting to us briefly about a really interesting article that she wrote about South Africa's political arena and how there seems to be, an entrance of Trump-style theatrics and politics, especially leading up to the upcoming elections. We've experienced it, as I told you before, went to the break twice in Cape Town and here in Pretoria. And we'll be chatting to Fazlin. She's joining us over the phone. Fazlin, assalamu alaikum. Welcome to Salam Media. Thank you so much for joining us.
Walaikum salam, as well as to your listeners and viewers.
First and foremost, reading your article, as someone, that has been, going into different communities across South Africa leading up to the elections, whether it's covering manifesto launches, or whether it's, doing the debates, hosting debates like we've been doing here, on Salam Media. I completely concur. There seems to be this surgeons of a Trump-style emotive politics. But if you can just, for our listeners, briefly summarize, the key points of your article. Our listeners that have not read the article, just so to get an understanding of what you and I will be discussing.
I think one of the key things when we look at what I mean by Trump-style politics, it's obviously not the policies, that Trump espoused, but it's more the tactics that he utilized. But I think one of the key things probably to understand is that these things are coordinated. Political parties, they think through how do we elicit emotion. It's not just what you do off the cuff. And one of the biggest misnomers, I think, when people think about Trump-style politics is people assume that he always just spoke off the cuff. And that his campaign, for example, and as well as the campaign of Brexit, as well as the campaign of Bolsonaro in Brazil, because they all have the same similarities, and in actual fact used very similar to run that campaign, what we'll see is that they all used the very same strategy. And so it was planned. It was, understanding. So if you, for example, look at the Muslim community, one of the things that we always talk about in marketing is, before you market to somebody, understand what their pain points are. Because once you understand what their pain points are and what it is ultimately that moves them from a pain-based perspective, then you utilize that in your campaign in a way that elicits that emotion. So for example, I was listening to the references that you made with regards to the debates, and I was fortunate to watch, I think, both of them. Is that ultimately those type of tactics that were utilized was thought through. It was thought through in the way in which we, make sure that we elicit a specific type of emotion from people. Because when you do that, people start to group with those that they know, those that are like them, or like them. And according to demographic groups. And, it's very easy to dismiss it as, intolerance has swept into our political landscape. And I don't think it's intolerance. I think it's pure tactics by political parties across the board, because they've seen what has worked across the pond, and they've seen how that has mobilized a whole sector of a population around specific pain points. And then to utilize that as real policy positions around those issues.
And looking at it, would you say this is how South African politics have always been done, or this is something that's emerging because of a trend that was set by the West? You did mention Donald Trump and his time as a president of the U.S. and his campaign before that, and also the Brexit strategy by the British Prime Minister at the time. But here in South Africa, before this year's elections, how were things? Is it the same? Has it always been that way, or this is a new strategy that's being employed?
I think there's two sides to it. So I think South African politics historically has been based on ideology. You could look at any political party and you could put them in an ideological box. So even if they used emotions, to elicit a response from voters, you would know that it would fit within a particular ideological box. The problem with the Trump style tactics is that it is all populism. It's not really based on an ideological position. And here I want to cite a particular political party as a reference. I want to cite the Patriotic Alliance. Now, if you look at the tactics that the Patriotic Alliance uses, a lot of people think that Gayton McKenzie, for example, is using Trump-style politics. But they're also just thinking that he's saying anything that comes out of his mouth. But that is actually not the case. There has to have been some thought into it. For example, if you take policy around, illegal foreigners, and I think every single political party has a policy on that. But when you understand that policy is linked to a pain point of a particular sector of the population, and in this instance, unemployment, and this notion that, that is living on the ground where people believe that foreigners are taking their jobs. It's one thing to talk about that and, to raise awareness and to say, okay, we're going to deal with illegal foreigners. Something completely different to go to the border with guns as a stunt, to make people believe that you're actually doing something when that actually has no impact. So the reality is, and I'm using the Patriotic Alliance because they're an easy punch bag, but it's not just them. It's across the political spectrum. And I think this is where populism actually, supersedes, substance. And this is, for me, I think what is deeply problematic, because even if we look at it from the Muslim community's perspective, we are being told, which is a fair statement, don't vote for the Democratic Alliance because of their ties to Zionism, right? That is a statement that is coming out. But how many of these political parties that are saying that are actually backing up that statement with real governance plans if and when they come into power? And I think they're basing 90% of their campaign on one statement without really presenting to people a real plan going forward. And I think this is where our community, and I'm saying our community, I'm talking about the Muslim community in this instance, is being moved, swept up in this wave that we have to unseat the DA. But what does it mean in terms of who do you actually vote for? What are the policy positions they're going to put in place? Because, we talk about 9 wasted years of Jacob Zuma, but if we put in place people that have no plan, to govern, that have no ideological base in terms of where they're operating from, and therefore when they go into a coalition today, there'll be for nationalism, tomorrow there'll be anti-nationalism. If they don't articulate those things ahead of the time, the reality is you're going to be swept up in a wave of a particular emotion, but then we have to live with the consequences of the governance of those political parties when they get into power.
And I think this is a very important question. Why do you think political parties are employing this strategy? Is it because there's no plan? There's no, they're out of touch, when it comes to the issues that average normal South Africans are going through, or this is just a strategy that works. South Africans don't read manifestos anyway, so the only way you can communicate with them and get them to be active and get them excited and aroused and potentially vote for you is, as you put it, touch those pain points.
I think the key thing here is, I want to touch on the one point that you made, is that our people unfortunately don't read manifestos. However, if you were to go 30 years back, right, and specifically the generation that went through apartheid, a large sector of the population will understand basic ideological concepts, right? Today, if we were to ask the electorate, about these things, I think that there is a bit of, lack of that and that's, on the basis of the fact that the parties are not necessarily, not all of them, but a large portion of them are not necessarily putting forward ideological positions based on things or real solutions. And I want to cite even the Democratic Alliance. If you look at the campaign across the country, Rescue South Africa, it's very similar to the Trump's statement of drain the swamp, and the swamp obviously is in reference to Washington D.C. So it's theatrics that's being utilized across the board for different constituencies to elicit an emotion. Whether the reason, in terms of whether or not it works or why parties are employing it, I think is because we are emotional beings. That's the first thing. I think the second thing is we live in an entertainment age where people have a very short attention span. We live in TikTok generation, and when I say TikTok generation, I'm not just talking about millennials or Gen Z. That sort of short attention span has affected every sector of the population, irrespective of age group. And the reality is that we have become so used to 30 seconds a minute, 3 minutes, giving us information and us being entertained. If you look at, for example, the political parties' videos on social media that do really well, it's the ones that are really outlandish and make the most ridiculous statements on the one side, or they are really ethnocentric in terms of the fact that they appeal to an ethnic group or a religious group in an extreme way to be able to elicit a response. Now, it is one thing for a political party, and I want to cite the EFF, who definitely has a populist tactic. But the difference with the EFF is that it's actually backed up with sound policies. So when they, for example, say, we will nationalize, they actually mean that they will nationalize. Like, that is the policy position. But if you look on the flip side, if we say, we will deal with illegal foreigners. How are you actually going to deal with illegal foreigners? By going to the border with guns. I think there's a difference in the type of populism that is being used by different political parties. And I think the key difference is, and you touched on it, is whether or not they're based in politics or policy. And this is where we ask the question, and I see this trend specifically on people that are new entrants into politics, or they've formed new political parties. And so the easiest way to solidify relevance in the minds of the people is to ensure that people actually, is to appeal to their emotions. And the reality is we can develop frameworks to evaluate political parties. We can, look at the manifestos. We can go on voter education. We can do all of these things. But the reality is people will be moved by emotions, what resonates with them as individuals. And that's okay. The challenge that you just have is that how do we separate those that, actually have a plan from those that are just using that to be able to get in power? And I want to reference specifically the smaller political parties. And this is a challenge that I actually put out to journalists. I have noted quite a few manifestos that have been written are not written by the political parties themselves, but are actually AI generated. Now, most of us in marketing or in social media, you use AI to some extent. But if a political party is developing their manifesto based solely on what an artificial intelligence is putting out, you have to ask the question, whether or not that is, or have they embedded that ideology, or is it just what sounds really nice on pieces of paper and that we can present and say, hey, we have a manifesto. And there are ways for us, obviously, to fact check whether or not something has been, pushed through AI. But I have a feeling that a lot of the small political parties have done that just to be able to make sure that they're relevant, in this election. Now, this is not a discouragement against smaller political parties. I think the role that they play in this election is massive, and we can see it just based on their marketing tactics that they're using. But there are some that are really opportunistic, and there are others that I think actually have a deep policy positions with real plans, to change the living conditions of South Africa. So I think it's just a matter of us having to evaluate that. But it's very difficult when, emotion is being used to elicit responses.
And I want to ask one last question. We really press for time, so if you can keep it brief. We saw, we're seeing in these elections, there's a push, for the Muslim vote. There are political parties all coming to Muslim communities, saying exactly that, what Muslim people want to hear. And in the forefront of that is citing the issue of Palestine, which, most Muslim is close to the hearts of many Muslims. But as a voter, as a Muslim, how do I suss sensational politics, out? How do I listen and, trying to make sure that I don't fall victim, to what you're written about here? Because to me, lately, it has felt like the issue of Palestine, it has become low-hanging fruits for many political parties to just lash on, because they know that a lot of South Africans, a lot of Muslims are, very passionate about it, and would, at this point, I'm rarely behind anyone that says free Palestine and let's sever ties with Israel. So as a voter, how do you suss that out? We saw Julius Malema going to Lenasia, for instance, and telling people how a good Muslim should be voting and a good Muslim shouldn't be voting for the DA because of X, Y, and Z. And I think it's those kind of rhetorics and conversations and speeches that kind of almost feel ingenuine to me, but very, very difficult for people to see and suss out. How do you do it? How do you not fall victim?
That is actually a really important insight, and something I think all of us should be thinking about as we head to next week. I think one of the things we need to look at is consistency on the Palestinian issue. So this is separate now from local issues. So if you're going to vote solely on Palestine, I think one of the things that one has to look at is what has been the consistency of this, either individual that is talking or the political party, whether they're new or old, on this issue. I think that's the first thing, because, we know that this is being used as an election tactic. In actual fact, one of the things that I said just yesterday is I want to see how many, pro-Palestinian marches we're going to have after the 29th of May, because so much of it is driven by political parties. So I think we need to look at consistency. But I think the other aspect we need to look at is we need to look at what political parties are saying to other constituencies, because we must look at what they're saying to us. And the reality is it's like speaking with a forked tongue, because they'll say A to us, but they'll say B to somebody else. So there has to be a little bit of research that is done outside of appeals to your, group, whether it is an ethnic group, whether it is a religious group, whatever it may be. And I think that has to be something that we have to analyze. I think the other thing that we have to analyze, and this goes back to your point, this will be my last point, is we have to look at manifestos. We really do. Because parties that speak about Palestine, but speak about a two-state solution, are parties that are very similar to the DA's position. And we can crucify the DA for not calling, it's apartheid, for not calling it genocide. That is forbidden well. But the reality is the DA takes a two-state solution, which is not very different to many other political parties. But we now know, just based on where we are at the moment in the current situation in Palestine, that the two-state solution is practically impossible. So are they selling you something that really is not improbable, and they're just conforming to, a narrative that we put that out because that gives us a safe position? Or are they actually really pro-Palestinian in the sense that they actually take a position that says, that is outside of the norm? I don't want to prescribe, obviously, for political parties. So I do think there has to be some sort of investigation. I also think for existing political parties that are talking about the Palestinian issue, we need to look at their voting record in parliament, because there are some political parties that abstained from voting, and I know this came out at one of the Salam Media debates, that abstained from voting when the Palestinian issue came about. Yet are very much supposedly pro-Palestinian, at the moment during the election cycle. So I think these are the things we need to sift through as voters, because if we're just going to be moved by a person's speech, and we're not going to look at history, we're not going to look at policy, then we might be in a situation where, the reason why we vote for somebody is actually not a really good reason.
All right, I think we're going to leave it there, Fazlin. Thank you so much for joining us and giving us your time. Really interesting conversation, and giving really, really awesome inputs there while we're leading up to the 29th of May, which is next week, Wednesday. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners will benefit a lot from this conversation and your incredible article. We're going to leave it here for now.
Thanks so much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Salam. That was Fazlin there. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll be speaking to Asri about the City of Transport procurement policies and how much transparency is needed in that regard. We'll be speaking to two representatives, Nalim Rahim and also Asra Sirat, right after this.